Welcome and thank you for joining today's critical conversation on adultification bias of Black girls, co-sponsored by the Initiative on Gender Justice and Opportunity at Georgetown University Law Center and Georgetown University's Black Alumni Summit. I am Mannone Butler, a proud graduate of Georgetown University's Business School and Law Center. I'm pleased to serve alongside Eric Woods as co-chair of the Black Alumni Summit and thrilled to be a member of the Initiative on Gender Justice and Opportunities Attorney Advisory Board. I must note I was moved to join the board in significant part because of the trailblazing work the initiative has done regarding adultification bias and its implication for Black girls. Adultification bias hadn't been formally studied or named until the initiative released its report describing the research conducted by Dr. Jamelia Blake, a senior scholar at the initiative, who is a professor at Texas A&M University. The report has drawn international coverage and resonated with people across the country, especially given the implications for our children. If you're new to the topic or have been steeped in the work of the initiative, I trust today's discussion will fuel you to want to learn and lean in more. Before I introduce our moderator and speakers, please note the event will be recorded and posted to the initiative's website. Now on to our speakers. But first up, I'm pleased to introduce Shaun Robinson. We're honored that Shaun Robinson agreed to moderate this conversation. Shaun is an Emmy award-winning journalist, author, producer, and girls empowerment activist. She's been a host of Access Hollywood and contributed to news programs. Her work spotlighting the media and communities of color has received numerous awards. Shaun is committed to gender equity as the founder and president of the Shaun STEM, Health, Arts, Unity, and Neighborhoods Foundation for Girls. She's an advisor to the UN's Girls Up campaign and served on the board of Girls, Inc. Now on to our speakers. I am really thrilled to introduce to some and present to others Rebecca Epstein. Rebecca is the executive director of the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality. She is the founder of the Center's Initiative on Gender Justice and Opportunity, which focuses on race and gender with a special emphasis on youth. She has dedicated her career to race and gender equity, having worked as a senior trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice and as an alumna of Georgetown's Women's Law and Public Policy Fellowship Program. Rebecca has received several awards for a commitment to gender equity and serves as an advisor to, and has served as an advisor to numerous organizations focused on that mission. The event today highlights her work with Dr. Jamelia Blake to produce the reports on adultification bias, which is part of the initiative's mission to center girls of color in research, policy, and practice. We will also have joining our conversation Rhea Shinde. She's a third-year law student in the class of 2021 here at Georgetown Law Center. Congratulations, time is coming. Oh my goodness, this is so exciting. She joined the Initiative on Gender Justice and Opportunity as part of Georgetown's 2020 Summer Core program and stayed on with the initiative this academic year. Rhea is pursuing a legal career to understand the intersections between the social determinants of health and gender and racial justice. And certainly last but not least, Toella Pliakas. She's a graduating senior in the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown University, studying culture and politics and French. She serves as an intern at the initiative and writes frequently on the intersection of race, policing, and accountability for the Washington Post, including recently co-authoring an op-ed with Rebecca on adultification bias that was published in the Washington Post, where she's had several other articles published as well. Without further ado, I'm pleased to turn the program over to Shaun Robinson.
Mannone, thank you so much. I really appreciate that very warm introduction, and I'm honored to be here before this incredible panel and all of the people who have joined us today to talk about this very, very important issue. Thank you so much for tuning in. Rebecca, how are you? I think you might be on mute, Rebecca.
I am. You
There you
think
are.
after
How do you feel?
13 months.
Thank you.
I get it.
Yeah, it's good to, it's really good to connect with you. And it's an honor for me to be here. I'll just let the audience know that Rebecca and I connected probably now 2 years ago.
Yep.
My foundation, the Shaun Foundation for Girls, began working on a documentary about implicit bias towards African-American girls. And I connected with you, Rebecca, because of the work, the extraordinary work that you're doing in this area. So it's an honor for me to talk to you today about this subject that is very close to my heart. And hopefully we can come away today with some solutions to help protect our girls. First of all, talk a little bit about your background, Rebecca, and your work at the Georgetown Center on Poverty's initiative on gender justice and opportunity.
Sure. Thanks so much, Shaun. I'm so glad you're here to have this conversation. I come from a litigation background. So after law school and a clerkship, I worked, as Mannone mentioned, on race and sex discrimination cases at the Department of Justice in their Civil Rights Division, and also at a national public interest law firm here in DC. But when I came to Georgetown in the position I have now, working for Peter Edelman, who's our faculty advisor, I joined to continue the work that had just begun on what we called at the time our project on marginalized girls. And as our staff and as our work grew, we launched the initiative on gender justice and opportunity. We do research and we work on policy and practices to offer solutions that are all focused not only on the barriers to girls of color and low-income girls in our public systems like hospitals, the juvenile justice system, and schools, but also on solutions like restorative justice and access to healthcare.
Yes. So, you know what's so interesting? You and I connected before the Black Lives Matter movement started.
Yep.
And so we are hearing obviously more about the topic of bias, especially when it comes to African Americans. And I haven't heard much of the conversation directed towards Black girls, but Black people as a community. So tell me how this research came about. How did the idea come to you that we needed research and to focus specifically on Black girls and bias?
Well, I really appreciate that question because one of the biggest challenges that we face is the question, why focus on girls of color?
Yes.
And the reason is that they're never centered, often not only in research, but in the national conversation on reform, just like in police violence against people of color. It's the women and girls who are less often talked about, less
Yes.
readily centered. And when they are invisible, we cannot enact the kind of reform and the changes culturally that we need to do better, to support Black girls.
Right.
So it's part of our mission, really, to center Black girls in the conversation.
Yeah, and it's wonderful that you are doing this because it's so interesting, Rebecca. Whenever I have a conversation, and I've had countless conversations about, wanting to do this film about Black girls and bias towards Black girls, inevitably, people say to me, but what about Black boys? Black boys experience violence, Black boys. And the conversation always shifts from Black girls to Black boys. However, when we're having the conversation specifically about Black boys, no one ever says, well, what about Black girls? Do you agree with that?
I couldn't agree more. It's like you're reading my mind. So we get that challenge from funders who voice discomfort with funding a project that's not aimed at all youth, but is aimed at girls in particular, even though most of the solutions we offer would lift all boats, right?
Yes.
It would apply to all youth. But absolutely, we do get that question. And I further agree with you that question is rarely raised in men and boys centered initiatives. My Brother's Keeper, no one questioned that, right? Nor should they. And the school to prison pipeline has traditionally centered boys. So I think it's a good question to ask ourselves, why are we so uncomfortable focusing on Black girls and on other girls of color? And it's something that needs to be remedied.
Yes. What did your research find?
So we partnered with Jamelia Blake, as Mannone mentioned, at Texas A&M. She's the person who had come up with the concept of adultification bias, and we partnered to do this research and write up the report. And what adultification bias is, I should just start off saying that, it's a stereotype, really. So this isn't about the perception of certain girls as more mature based on their behaviors or on their responsibilities, but instead it's truly a bias in the sense of, without any other information but the color of their skin, do adults view Black girls as more adult-like and less innocent than their white counterparts? So a survey was sent out to adults across the country, and they were asked very overt questions, ranking 1 to 5, do Black girls need protection? Do Black girls need nurturing? Do Black girls need comforting? And randomly selected participants were asked the same question about white girls so that we could compare. And when Dr. Blake first showed me this survey, I said, you're being too obvious. People are going to know that they need to cover up their racism and not answer the question in a way that indicates we shouldn't treat Black girls with protection and nurturing. And she said, okay, we'll see. And she went forward with the survey as it was, and she was absolutely right. So the survey was divided into age brackets, and we were expecting to find a difference in perception of innocence between Black and white girls in adolescence, in high school. And yet what we found was that the biggest disparity in perceiving innocence in children was in the age group of 10 to 14. And the second biggest gap was in the age group of 5 to 9, with adolescent girls being third. So that result really shook a lot of people, because we're talking about the perception of innocence of girls as young as 5 years old, so potentially kindergarten age.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So adults, Black and white adults, view Black girls as young as 5 as more adult-like than their white counterparts.
Exactly.
So when we're talking about as young as 5, Rebecca, we're talking in the school, you said kindergarten, and at home. So these things are manifesting themselves in the home also. So we're talking about teachers and we're talking about parents also. Is that correct?
That might be correct. Yeah. Sitting at the law school the way we do, we're putting our focus on authority figures who can change the trajectory of Black girls' lives so fundamentally through this form of bias. So we're focused on teachers, police officers, and others who are decision makers over girls' lives on a broad scale.
Once they go out of the home and into the world. So in the school, if they have an encounter with an authority figure outside of the home. So what are some of the implications of this research? What happens?
We think that the biggest implication of this research is that it asks us to imagine it as one cause for the harsher treatment that Black girls receive. We know from research that whether it's school discipline, whether it's arrests on campus, whether it's at various touch points within the juvenile justice system, Black girls receive more punitive treatment than white girls. So why is that? We think that adultification bias can be one part of the puzzle. Because if you imagine, I like to say, imagine a judge who has a Black child in front of them, but what the judge is perceiving is a miniature adult who has the maturity to take responsibility for their actions and should have known better. Isn't it likely that the judge would be less likely to be lenient towards that person than toward a white girl whom the judge might perceive as innocent and needing guidance and nurturing?
So, if it got to a situation, but even before it gets to the judge, we saw a Black girl, I think she was like 9 years old or something, being handcuffed.
In Rochester.
Yes, being handcuffed. And even before that, in school, as you said, teachers are more likely to call authorities on a Black girl
Yeah.
than her white counterparts.
That's what the research shows.
Yes. As young as 5 years old. I mean, that is heartbreaking, extraordinary. And just as when you saw this research, what did you think?
I was shocked because, as I said, I was totally had my attention on high school age. I had assumed that what we were going to find was once adults viewed teenagers, that's when those kinds of perceptions of being grown up are going to occur, because that is a time when there is a big, big adolescent developmental milestones are reached in high school. I was shocked that with, like I said, such overt questions where you're ranking how much you think a 5 to 9-year-old child needs comforting, that you would rank a Black girl as needing that less than white girls.
I did my foundation sponsored a town hall of Black girls, they were teenage girls, I think as young as 12, 13, all the way up to, I think the oldest one was 21. And they talked about their experiences walking through this world as a Black girl. Mm-hmm. And so many of them were just brought to tears about why is it that we are experiencing these microaggressions throughout our lives? And why can't, I remember one young lady said, why can't we just be? Why is it that we feel like we don't have the protection of society, that they cast us to the side? What have you found has been the response from Black women and girls from this research?
Similar to what you did, we brought together focus groups across the country led by Black women, and the participants were all Black women and girls. And what we did was showed them the results of our survey and asked them to respond to it. And just as you're indicating, it was so painfully obvious to the participants to describe that adultification bias was even a thing. One of them said, hearing you announce your findings is like hearing you announce that the sky is blue. I mean, of course. But what we wanted to do was to validate our findings in a sense by hearing what their experiences were. And really almost to a person, they did validate that experience of you should have known better, being treated with less leniency than white girls of the same age.
Yes. We talked about these pictures that we've seen on the news, this video about these young Black girls being handcuffed or handled. I remember this video of this girl. It was a Black girl. She was like about 14 or 15. She was in high school, and the teacher told her, because of whatever, I don't know if she was on her phone or whatever, the teacher told her to get off her phone. She called the school security. These two guys, huge security guards, police officers, come into the classroom. One picks the girl up from her desk and literally slams her to the ground in front of all of the other students. He was handling her. She wasn't armed or anything like that. He was handling her like she was like some dude, What have you seen? How have you seen this adultification manifested today?
Well, the report has done a great job in raising awareness, and it's really entered the mainstream as a topic of conversation, but it certainly hasn't stopped it from happening. And so those kinds of incidents that you just mentioned keep occurring. So we need to do more. In that one incident in Rochester that you mentioned, that we wrote an op-ed about, the police officer came out and said to this 9-year-old Black girl, "You're acting like a child." What she was doing was expressing fear that they were going to pepper spray her and that she wanted her father.
Yes.
And she had the presence of mind to say, "I am a child." But it doesn't get much more overt than that we do have a problem with our authorities expecting Black girls to behave like adults or dehumanizing them to the extent that they can treat them roughly, justify violence against young girls.
What about any solutions, Rebecca, being created in response to this research? What have you seen?
Well, one of the exciting things that we've seen since coming out with this research is local efforts to combat adultification bias.
Yes.
We set up a website, and adultificationbias.org, to try to collect some of them. But it's been gratifying to see our national research being translated into local action. There are folks in California who are trying to set aside playtime for Black girls to celebrate their innocence at a young age. There are people in Austin who formed a coalition to raise awareness of adultification bias and to train defense attorneys to be aware of it and to combat it in the courtroom. So we are seeing some mobilization around this issue that might bring about some change.
Yes, okay. Fascinating work. The research, every time I quote the research, people are like, they're just astounded. And I think one of the things that when I say we, I mean we at the African-American community, we have to understand that we are holding some of these biases against these young girls. It's not only white people, but it's also Black people who are holding these biases against our girls. I want to bring in Toella Pliakas. She is our student intern. How have you, first of all, congratulations on your college graduation. You wrote a piece in the Washington Post last month with Rebecca on adultification bias. Toella, what motivated you to write the piece, and what do you hope that audiences will take away from it?
Sure. Thank you for the congratulations. What sort of motivated the piece was, like Rebecca mentioned at the end of January, police officers in Rochester handcuffed and pepper sprayed a 9-year-old girl and forcefully shoved her into the back of a police car. And I remember the day that news broke, I had my weekly check-in meeting with Rebecca, and we both could just barely focus on our work for the week.
Yes.
We were just having a really difficult time talking about anything other than that topic. And we were both feeling so sort of angry and hopeless about what had taken place. And of course, the fact that situations like this are not uncommon. And we were about halfway through our call, and we were both just feeling all of these emotions and feeling like we wanted to do something, but we weren't sure what. And I said to Rebecca, you have expertise in this field. Maybe it would be worthwhile for us to say something about what's taken place and raise awareness of an element of this incident that people may not be familiar with. The element, of course, being adultification bias. And I think I was kind of hoping that people would take away from this piece two things. The first being that it would raise awareness about adultification bias. People would come away from reading it knowing what adultification bias is and understanding how it sort of functions and manifests through our public institutions. And secondly, I was hoping that the article would bring to light that our public institutions that interact with children should be working within frameworks that are developmentally appropriate for children. And people who interact with children should be trained to do so with care and respect for them as children. These should be people who are trained to work with children.
When we brought up the story of that little girl, that 9-year-old girl, and it still just like breaks my heart when I think about it today. Toella, did you see yourself in her? As a Black woman, did you think, the same type of lack of support, lack of care, lack of protection that this little girl was experiencing? Did you see yourself in her?
Sure. I have not had as traumatic an experience as she did, but I do remember that when I was a little girl, I had this little denim purse that I used to carry around with snacks and pens and a little journal because I loved to write and read. And my favorite genre at the time was apocalypse books. And I remember I kept like Band-Aids and like nutrition bars. So if I was kidnapped by like time traveling wizards, I would be prepared. And I loved that little purse so much because it was sort of like a manifestation of my childhood fantasies in these like dream worlds. And I remember when I was in 5th grade, my teacher came up to me and she said, you know, your mother should not let you carry that purse around. That is, purses are for grown women. You are acting way too grown. And she was just sort of able to suck all of the joy out of my relationship to those little fantasy worlds. Mm-hmm. And now, at the time, I didn't really know what was going on. But now I realize that she had assigned a sexualized, overly adult characterization to developmentally normal behavior. Yes. And I definitely felt a sense of shame and that I had done something wrong. And it reminds me also of a general sense of pressure that my mom and other moms of Black girls that I grew up around felt to make sure that we dressed really young and that they felt a lot of pressure to make sure that we were not sexualized before, to make sure that the world didn't sexualize us before, as we were children.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. I mentioned earlier that my foundation had sponsored a talk with Black girls about bias as a whole against them. And one of the young ladies who she's 20 now, I've known her since she was like 13 years old. She's the daughter of a Spelman sister of mine. And her name is Sydney, and she talked about it. And Sydney's always been the tallest girl in her class. She has curves. She always had curves since she was very little. She usually is the largest girl in her class. And she talked about when she was at school, when she was in, I think, middle school, and the school had given all of the girls skirts to wear. And your skirt could not come. You had to hold your arms down by your sides. And if your skirt came higher than your fingertips, then you had to, you couldn't wear the skirt. That was against the rule. And so she said, I have very long arms, my behind is curvy. And when I put my arms down, the teacher called her out in the front of the class and said, your skirt is too short. Actually, what she said was, your butt is too big for the skirt in front of the class. So she immediately signed fault to her body, as opposed to calling out the fact that they don't make skirts for all size girls. And she was humiliated in front of the class. Right. And she was in a class where I think she was the only Black girl. And she carried that trauma with her, for years and years. So I understand what you were saying just about bodies being hypersexualized. Absolutely. And being and girls being assigned fault for something that they didn't have any control over. I want to bring in Rhea. I'm sure she is ready to get into the conversation. Rhea is a research assistant at the initiative. Hi, Rhea. Congratulations on becoming a law school graduate. You have been working on at the initiative regarding adultification bias. What has your work been like? What have you found and been most interested in?
Yeah, thank you so much, Shaun. So as Mannone said, I joined the initiative in June of last year in 2020. And at that time, the team was engaged in tracking the work of some of the local initiatives that Rebecca mentioned, who are sort of combating adultification bias after the release of that 2017 report. And the goal of that effort was to sort of monitor how that national research that the initiative released has been translated into local action in different communities across the nation. So we were able to identify over the past year over 16 local organizations that are at various stages of development, and they're focused on combating adultification bias against Black girls through trainings of juvenile justice professionals, as Rebecca mentioned, fundraising, targeting diverse audiences, and education professionals and policymakers. And so sort of across all the different systems, including education and juvenile justice, all these initiatives are working within their communities to make that change based on the research that came out of the initiative. And so what they are really doing is using that research to define the issue of adultification bias and sort of contextualize their local advocacy efforts. And so go ahead.
What has been the standout for you? What makes you go, I can't believe what is being uncovered here? I mean, we, as I've been talking about this for the last, few years, a couple of years, everything that Rebecca tells me about from the study, I could say, I've gone through that, or I know of somebody who's gone through that. For you, what has been the thing that has stood out to you the most?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it is for me that stands out too, is that these experiences aren't new, and they're things that we experience within our communities. We see them happening, we hear it on the news, but it is so much harder to organize and to talk about those experiences without that language and without that research. And so what has been really, sort of hopeful, something that's hopeful for me is being able to see how different groups, different activists and organizers are using this research to sort of make that change in their communities and using the language that has come out of the report.
Yeah, I'd like to get your opinion, ladies, about what I talked to Rebecca about earlier, about every time I bring up, I told you we were working on this documentary about Black girls. Every time I bring up the issue of Black girls and bias against the Black girls, the conversation shifts. What about Black boys? What about Black boys? Well, Black boys have the Black boys. Yeah. Listen, I have brothers. I got my father, God rest his soul, male cousins and all that. I can't keep the conversation on Black girls. However, when the conversation is about Black boys and Black men, nobody ever stands up and says, well, what about Black girls? Let's shift the focus to Black girls. It never stays on Black girls. Why do you think that is? Toella, I'm going to ask you that question.
That's a big question. I think that a lot of it has to do with the intersection of racism and sexism. We've always been some of the most marginalized folks in our society. We're expected to kind of just sit back and, let research happen and let societal change happen that impacts others, and be happy when, even during the suffrage movement, be happy when white women gain the right to vote, but don't, we're expected to not ask for too much. But I think
also Black women have been the caretakers.
Right.
Really?
Right.
Caretakers. We've been the ones who have tried to make sure that the males have been, and the children have been protected in our society. And we have been used to being last.
I think that we've always been very supportive historically of Black men's liberation. And I think it's time for us to, join together and be supportive of all Black liberation. I think that what it really comes down to is changing societal structures and, supporting research that focuses on Black girls specifically and doesn't just further marginalize, supporting public institutions that focus on Black girls specifically. I think that's where we'll find change ultimately for what we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay,
Shaun,
yes, go ahead, Rebecca.
I would love to just respond to what you brought up, because I completely agree with Toella that there's historically been an undervaluing of women and girls of color, and Black women and girls of color in particular. And society is complicit in not centering them. But there is that misperception that you raised that girls are fine. And we expect, and we even permit boys to externalize their challenges. We expect and we permit them to lead. But when it comes to girls, they're expected to do well in school, internalize their challenges, and take care of everybody else and not lead and not challenge authority. And so when they don't meet those expectations, the perception is that we need to blame the girl.
Yes.
And otherwise, to the extent that girls are meeting that standard, it's why should we fix what isn't broken? Girls are doing fine, aren't they? Black girls are doing fine.
Yes.
So I really appreciate your raising that issue.
Yes. We're going to go to some questions from our audience. We received the same question from several audience members. What can we do to protect our girls? And I will start with number one, you have to understand that there is an issue. You have to understand why we all are behaving a certain way towards Black girls. We have to understand that we have this bias. But who would like to take that question? What can we actually do? What are some solutions to adultification bias?
Let me start out, Shaun, if I might, with some of the list of things that we've come up with, because we're raring to go on the solutions front. We need to get rid of punitive disciplinary systems in school. We need to reduce police presence in school and in the community, because it's Black girls' bodies that are always being surveilled. Now, I feel like the issue of curves, which you raised earlier, is somewhat of a red herring, because it's the surveillance that's the problem, and it's the gaze at the girls that is the problem, rather than the girls' bodies themselves. Dress codes need to be fixed so that they are less susceptible to biased interpretations of them. And we need to learn, as Toella mentioned, about adolescent developments so that authorities in girls' lives can interact more appropriately with Black girls as children.
Mm-hmm.
But Toella and Rhea, please add to that list.
I would also say that one of the things that our initiative and that local initiatives are really focusing on is creating the space to share the stories and the experiences that girls have and that folks have when they become adults, traumas that they might have encountered when they were younger. And so creating a safe space within a community and a brave space for people to be able to talk about those experiences and contextualize them amid a systemic problem rather than something that was about who they were as people, to sort of think about how those systems interact to sort of discriminate against young girls and have these harsher punishments.
Yes. Toella?
I completely agree with what everyone else is saying. I'm a firm believer in counselors, not cops, in interacting with children. And I'm a firm believer in sort of raising awareness that this issue even exists, and raising awareness about the stereotypes that Black women are often faced with.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And coming from Hollywood, I can tell you about those stereotypes because we talked about them during the town hall that we did with the Black girls that I talked to. And many of them talked about not being able to see themselves in Hollywood, not being able to, the images of Black girls in Hollywood, whether it's, in movies, on television, they're the sassy girl, the one that talks back. They're they have these images of girls that have been stereotypical for decades and decades. And how do we start to change the images that we show on television and in the movies about who Black girls are? Why don't we see a diverse image of Black girls and Black females when it comes to Hollywood? Because Hollywood is responsible for shaping many images of folks who have never run into a Black girl before. The only Black girl they've ever seen has been on TV. So we received a question from Lois Fishman asking, when and why did this tendency to see Black girls as adult-like take root? Rebecca, I'll pose that question to you.
So that wasn't part of our study, so I can't answer that from a researcher's perspective about where it took hold, but I think it's just what you were talking about. We hypothesize in our report that the roots go way back to the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow discrimination and really state-sanctioned violence against Black women who were dehumanized from the beginning through those stereotypes that you're talking about: angry, hypersexualized, threatening, a lot of justification we see for violence against Black girls is that they were perceived as threatening, even if they were handcuffed, even if they were a bikini in Texas, and where we saw an officer kneeling on a Black teenager's back during a pool party.
Yes.
So those tropes are still there, and they're being projected onto very young girls.
Yes, yes. Every single Black woman that I know has been called difficult, or says she has been called difficult, angry, something to that effect during her, her business career. But those labels didn't just start as adults. They started long before that.
And they have horrific consequences.
Yes,
too,
they
right?
do.
So Philip Goff is a professor who conducted a study on adultification in Black boys in 2014. And he discussed how dehumanization through depriving a person of their innocence in your mind's eye can actually be associated with harsher police activity against that person.
Yes, yes, yes. We have a question from Michelle. What are some tools that can work effectively to help law enforcement agencies assist young Black girls in the criminal justice system? Rebecca?
Well, as I said before, I think we need to see fewer police, especially in our schools to start off with. But it is an interesting question. And I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Monique Morris, who's a longtime partner of ours, the author of Push Out. And she and I conducted research in the American South on school-based police officers and girls of color and their interactions. And one of the things that was striking to us was how little training there was out there for them to learn how to do better by girls of color. And the other thing that was striking was how hungry the officers were for just such training. Even the officers that want to do better don't have the resources to do better. So we need to start that training on all kinds of levels about adolescent development, about adverse childhood experiences, about racial bias and gender bias in order for police to do better. But history shows that Black girls are affected much more harshly by police presence than others. And so we need fewer of them in our lives.
Yes, we interviewed, for this documentary, we interviewed one researcher who did a study about quantifying bias. And we looked at this graphic where white men are here, white women, Black men, and Black women. So white women experience sexism from white men and Black men. Black men experience racism from white women and white men. Black women experience racism from white men and white women and sexism from Black men and white men. So it's the double whammy of being a Black female.
And that's the critical importance of the concept of intersectionality and intersectional discrimination that Kimberly Crenshaw, I think, first coined many years ago, and has become mainstreamed, I think, since. A lot of people are talking about it. We need to do more.
Right. And what you said about lifting all boats, Rebecca, is so important, because this is not an issue about Black females against Black males. It's not that. It's about taking care of a group that is never at the center of the research, and never at the center of the focus and the attention.
That's right. And the problem is that girls' experiences are unique. So it doesn't work to not focus on them. I mean, we have a saying that you can't just take a solution for boys and paint it pink and have it work for girls. You need to investigate what's happening for girls that's unique to them, what they respond to that's unique for them, in order to put those solutions into effect.
Rebecca, another question for you. What challenges have you faced in doing your work?
Well, we were just talking about the biggest one, right? Which is keeping the focus on girls.
Nobody wants to focus on Black girls.
And the questions that we get that really reflect this discomfort with leaving men and boys out of the conversation. Related to that, we do have challenges in getting support. I mentioned that a lot of foundations question our focus on girls as well. We're independently funded, and so we have to fundraise for everything from our salaries to our programming costs, but it's hard to find sources that are willing to support this work.
That's awful. I mean, it's you know, it's so frustrating. And Rebecca, you and I have talked so many times about about your research and the documentary that we're doing about Black girls. Nobody wants to focus on this issue. Nobody wants to focus. And what happens when, the problem starts at 5 years old and it's not addressed, it's not taken care of. And these girls are growing into women that are carrying this baggage from these biases that society has placed on them. And it's manifesting itself in different ways in their adult life and in their adult career. So
that's absolutely true. And as you're growing up, one of the things that you're doing is absorbing the messages that the culture is giving you about expectations of who you are and how you'll behave.
And it affects our health, because we're like, we've got all this stress, we've been internalizing all this and knowing that nobody wants to focus on this issue, and that affects our health,
Absolutely.
One of the divisions of my foundation is about health, and all of the health disparities when it comes to Black women and all of this, the heart disease, cancer, and I mean, the list goes on and on and on. A lot of that is because of, once again, this burden, this baggage that we carry throughout our lives.
Yeah, and what you're talking about is these adverse childhood experiences, right? Yeah. Which in the last decade or so has recently increased in people's awareness of the long-term potential health effects, mental health and physical health, that can happen if adverse childhood experiences aren't addressed. But the good news is that there are buffers that can mitigate those poor outcomes if they're in place. And so that's where the solutions come into play. And one of those, for example, is connections to school and to teachers and to peers at school. And that's where our work on restorative justice has come in, where we conducted focus groups under the leadership of a different senior scholar of ours, Toella Gonzalez. And we've been talking to Black and Latina girls who have engaged in restorative practices in school and really feel like that was one solution for them that connected them to their peers, that humanized teachers to them and that humanized themselves to teachers. And that's the kind of thing that can disrupt the poor health outcomes that can be rooted in racism and other forms of adversity.
Yes, and my girlfriends and I were like, stop calling ourselves strong Black women, okay? As long as we carry this, we're strong Black women, our needs will never be taken care of, because everybody's expecting us to be strong and everybody's expecting us to just deal with it. And sometimes we're not like that. We need that protection. We need that comfort. We need that support. So Mannone, hi there.
Hi there. There are a few more questions. There are a few more questions that have come in. I think we have a few more moments, and so I'm going to pose those. One of the questions: there are increasing conversations about implicit bias training in various areas like policing and employment. What would adultification bias training look like, and where should that training be targeted?
Well, that's something I talk to Dr. Blake about a lot, and she's a clinical psychologist. I'm a lawyer. I'm less equipped to be able to extend that kind of curricula, but we are hoping to work on those, and we very much encourage others to work on the content of those trainings as well. But the short answer is those trainings belong anywhere there is a system that has authority over Black girls' lives, because there is a systemic problem, and the only way to try to get at its root is to educate people who have such authority over the outcomes of Black girls to do better.
And I'm going to just keep them coming with the questions, because, and I'm thinking about now the seat that I sit in all day, every day. I head up a criminal justice agency in the District of Columbia. And so this next question speaks to, I think, what many folks who are in the system, who are system actors may have. And one of our colleagues, what can I do as a juvenile public defender?
Mm. Well, this brings into play what Rhea and I were talking about. The Innocence Initiative in Austin actually has developed an anti-bias training for defense attorneys. Mm. And the reason that they developed that, I actually was approached by defense attorneys in some of my presentations across the country saying, even defense attorneys need to be aware of their own bias against Black girls, because in order to fully defend Black girls, they need to see them as innocent too. So for defense attorneys, I think they sit in a unique place where they themselves need to be informed and guard against adultification bias against their own clients, but also to be able to identify it within the system and be able to draw out the innocence of their clients for the benefit of judges and prosecuting attorneys who might be holding that bias themselves.
You know, I'm thinking about our next question. Again, I mentioned in the District of Columbia, we recently had 2 Black girls aged 13 and 15 attempted to carjack an Uber driver with a taser. Unfortunately, during this attempted crime, the 66-year-old Uber driver died. Clearly, the girls didn't intend to kill anyone, but many of the commentators, Black and white, have urged that they be charged as adults. Do you think that if the girls were white, the public would still feel the same? How can we change the way society adultifies Black girls and treats them in the criminal justice system? That's a really full question.
Well, I think the answer is clearly no. Shaun, I'm sure you would, I speak for you too, that they would not be treated the same if they were white. That's the short answer. And that's the kind of discrepancy we see all the time. Shaun, were you gonna?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to know what was they felt that, tell me that again, they felt that the Black girls are being treated too harshly. And if the perpetrators were white, or alleged perpetrators were white, they would get off? Or
the underlying sentiment is that these Black girls, 13 and 15 years old, the commentators have really urged that they be charged as adults. That would not occur if they were white. That's the contention of the person's question, or the undercurrent of the person's
Got it.
question.
Yes, I don't know. I don't know enough about that case to comment on that. Yeah, I'm not sure.
But it is a huge problem that we see as lawyers, that there is a certain amount of discretion in treating children, not in the juvenile justice system, but in the adult criminal justice system. And we really need to interrogate what goes into the racial disparities that we see in those decisions and stop them through reform efforts.
Okay. And we have someone who's a PhD student who would like to focus research on adultification bias. And so the question is, in which areas is further research needed and or recommended?
Well, this was a pilot study, so there's a lot more research that can be done. A lot of people ask about whether this holds true for Latina girls and other girls of color. That's one area of research that I'd be interested in. And also, breaking down the adults by their profession, for example, by their race, by their age, to really develop anti-bias training targeted to the audience you're speaking to. It would be helpful to know more on a broader scale about who is holding these racist perceptions and who needs the training.
Great, thank you. And lastly, Shaun, you mentioned the documentary. There were questions around the documentary. If you could just share a bit about the documentary.
Yes, so the documentary is titled "Who Cares About Black Girls?" And we've been working on it for quite a while. The Shaun Foundation for Girls is producing the documentary, and we're looking at the research that Rebecca has done there at Georgetown Law, but also, my background is in news. And so as I've been researching this topic, it's fascinating because here's the thing, I think the word racism, by now, people just kind of they just shut down. They're like, they feel like you're either a racist or you're not a racist. Bias is something that everybody carries. And as we've been talking about in this particular conversation, the biases against Black girls are affecting their self-esteem, their chances for success, and how we all as a society suffer because there's a whole pool of possible talent that we are looking right over, people who can contribute to our society, but they have been carrying these biases from society for so long. It affects them in so many different ways. So we're looking at that, and we're currently raising money. For the documentary. You can go to the Shaun Foundation for Girls for more information. And because I really feel that this is a topic that people need to know more about, because just as all of us in the last couple of years or last few years, as we've been reading about this research and we're going, oh my gosh, I didn't know this to be true. This is something that not a lot of people know about. And as soon as we start to confront our own biases, we can put an end to this adultification, the hypersexualization, the criminalization of Black girls. So that's one of the things that I am working on. So you can go to the Shaun Foundation for Girls for more information, ShaunFoundationForGirls.org for more information.
All I can say is thank you all. This has been just such an important conversation, a critical conversation, and one that we must continue. Shaun Robinson, thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for your commitment. Thank you for your presence today and moderating this important conversation. Rebecca Epstein, Toella Pliakas, and Rhea Shinde. I mean, this is really, thank you for what you do all day, every day, and what you're pouring. And as a Georgetown alum, I'm so proud to just be associated with you and thrilled to be a part of today's conversation. I certainly want to thank the audience for joining in and your engagement. The questions have been flowing in. There are more to come, and so we'll make sure that the questions are responded to. And we certainly invite you to stay tuned and to learn more about the work of the initiative. And you can visit our website, genderjusticeandopportunity.georgetown.edu. to just keep up to date and to stay plugged in. And certainly on a personal note, you heard Rebecca note just the challenges, and this is kind of one of those underlying themes, right, around fundraising and support. The initiative is certainly underway. But there's a fundraising challenge that's underway now. And so more information to come on that. And for those who've signed up, you'll get information on that. I just really am just so appreciative of this conversation, those who tuned in, and certainly on behalf of my co-chair, Eric Woods, with the Black Alumni Summit, thank you, as well as my colleagues on the Attorney Advisory Board. More to come. Please stay tuned, and let's continue to lean into this very important issue and work. Be well and take care, everyone.
Thanks so much.